Hi everyone, I'm Saj Razvi. I'm the Director of Education at PSI. I'm the founder here as well. Boy, what can I say? I run trainings here and I run the supervision groups as well as the didactic lectures that we do. And I'll just say for me, we've been doing this for a while now. We've been sort of working in this, PSIP, Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy, is a somatic trauma model that's specifically designed for the psychedelic state of consciousness, right? And so we've been working in that model for a period of time now. And I will tell you that I am never, I'm constantly amazed at what shows up in people's process. When people join our, when we see them in our 3-person trainings, their systems take a deep dive, and we go in. People are saying my sound is a bit low. Hang on, let me see if I can adjust here.
I'm hearing you fine.
Oh, you are? Okay. Okay, I'll do this. So I was saying that, so this work ceases to continually amaze me. And, I feel like, we have this modality that really is supportive of people getting to this place inside of themselves, but really the work is happening through this really amazing signal that shows up in everybody's process, that's organic, it's natural, and it's deeply intelligent. And so every time I see that, I find myself amazed by it. It's redeeming to me, since we see so much horror in the world today. Horror in terms of what we're capable of doing. And yet when we see what happens when people make contact with this deep place inside of their direct experience, there's it really counterbalances all of the insanity in the world for me. So that's just me. Yeah. Eric?
Hey, Saj.
My name's Eric, and I live near Vancouver, British Columbia, on Sumas Matsqui territory. And I do trainings in Vancouver, but more so in Europe these days. I'll be in Italy actually in November, and I believe there's still a spot for that one. I'll be with Carrie Gleiser for that training. And you may have seen her on some of the webinars that PSI has done. So I'm very excited about that. I'll be back in Europe next summer as well. And yeah, I did a lot of different types of psychedelic healing before I found PSIP. And nothing that I did has the depth of attachment trauma healing that I've experienced with PSIP. And yeah, and I love that about it. And it continually surprises me as well with what shows up. The challenge and the beauty, all of it. And I'm very excited to be here. The 4 of us were on a call a few days ago talking follow-up questions from Love, Light, and Trauma, and that was a very rich discussion. So I'm really glad to be back for another. Pass it over.
Which, by the way, we can do that here as well, right? So meaning that if there's a lot more questions than we have time to answer, then we can do sort of the same kind of follow-up video and release it to everybody on the call. You just have to post it in the chat.
Thanks. I'll pass it over to Jaya. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I do trainings in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, and on the East Coast. I would have to say that the reason I love this model is because I'm obsessed with complexity theory. I'm obsessed with complex adaptive systems, and our organism is one complex adaptive system. And if you think about complex systems, complexity theory, it's all about tapping into that deep intelligence that Saj is talking about in ways in which can facilitate new opportunities. We're trying to access an intelligence that knows how to, that has sort of a moral fabric to it and knows how to restore order to not just our lives, but the lives of systems. So what is a system? A system is the self, but it's also a family system, right? It can be a community. So when we begin to tap into what Saj is calling the signal, or this deep intelligence, we're tapping into something very mysterious that, like Saj is talking, using the word discovery, that we can be in awe of. Like, we just don't know what's on the other side as we begin to tap into our direct experience, because there's something very discovery oriented to it. There's an emergence, there's something new that wants to be born out of this complexity, out of this stuckness. And that's why I love this model, because it really, in some ways, yes, it's very much about deep, complex trauma and a lot of suffering, but there's something very alive to it. There's something very, there's so much potential in it. There's something very rich and sustenant and organic to it that really is craving, this intelligence really is craving a restoring of order, bring life back to the human being, the complexity of the human being, as well as whether you're working at a couple's level or a family level, it wants to restore this order. It wants to restore this order in a way that has a sense of health and humanity and morality to it. And so it speaks to my heart. All right. Daniel?
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Daniel Kim. I'm the instructor for Los Angeles. I would say the main thing that draws me to this work, I think usually when you see the word psychedelics in any form of therapy, people get very excited about the potential speed of the process. For me, with PSIP, I think there is speed that comes with it, but more so like what you can access with this work when we target dissociation, when we emphasize relationship, when we lean on the nervous system to process the material rather than the mind. And that's what gets me the most excited about this work. That's what got me to become a client in this work initially. The topic I'm very excited in discussing, things around destabilization. It was one thing that made me hesitant in re-entering the psychedelic therapy space after having my own destabilizing experience, which lasted about 2.5 years. And I think talking about different features and aspects that lead to destabilization, as well as why it shows up and how to support it, is quite important. And I think us here at PSIP, at PSI, do a good job at kind of understanding these levers and the necessity around that. So excited to be here and good to see everyone.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there, I feel like there's a number of different ways that we can begin. And Eric, you had a sort of a good maybe way to go into it. And also, just as you were describing this, Daniel, I thought maybe one other alternative is to sort of go in and really describe what destabilization can look like. I think probably most people on this call know what destabilization looks like in traditional therapy, and they might not know what it looks like in psychedelic therapy. But where are people feeling, like in terms of, like entering into it?
I'm open to that. I'd also add, maybe people don't know what destabilization looks like from a traditional therapy point of view. So maybe there could be a,
yeah,
back and forth on that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it would be good maybe if we each shared a little bit of like what destabilization, either what we traditionally see, what it looks like in therapy or psychedelic therapy, or maybe personally, what it's looked like for us.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, Daniel, not to put you on the spot, but you mentioned 2 years of destabilization. So that's a long time. I think most
Yeah.
people listening to this would say 2 years of destabilization. That seems extreme.
So to be clear, the 2 years of destabilization started prior to PSIP. So I definitely have had multiple pockets of destabilization with this work. But the destabilization I experienced I think it was so profound and the duration was so long because I had no solution in my system. There was no sense that life was different in the present moment. There was no sense of relationship being, being healthy or supportive or non-threatening. So my background comes with significant physical abuse in the first 12 months of my life. So once that started to emerge in my system through a synthetic mushroom experience that I had, the sense of fear and terror, as well as the mixture of rage around that, was just in the background throughout my waking life. So whether that's like having night terrors or always having shakiness and fear responses around people that I've known for 20 years that have never harmed me, having fear around just people in general, like to the point if I'm jogging on the streets, I'm getting like images of people just coming and attacking me or doing something like that. But that was just like the baseline that I experienced. And I think the first 3 to 6 months of it, I thought I broke something in my psyche. I've done a lot of psychedelic journeys prior to that point, but I've never been destabilized to that degree. And like my system not reorganizing in the sense that whatever aspect of my trauma that emerged didn't get tucked back away, didn't get compartmentalized, it didn't go under dissociation again. So it just stayed like above the surface without fully understanding what it was because I wasn't really clear about my history at that time. But it was a lot of that for 2 years, a lot of like physical symptoms as well too. My GI system was like fluctuating a lot. And prior to that, I had chronic health issues, but those things started to get exacerbated with it. But I guess the best way of describing it is just never being able to regulate. There was never a pocket where my system fully settled. And I would say my situation is more extreme. I haven't worked with a client that's had this level of destabilization. But I was also pushing for material to come out and doing the high dose trips and also doing a lot of intensive meditation seemed to fracture one of my defense structures to allow it to push out. And yeah, it was going through that experience made me very wary of doing psychedelic therapy with another client because I would never want anyone to go through that type of experience. It's incredibly difficult to function or to be around people when you're in that state, and it's very confusing.
Yeah. So would you say it was basically, I think what you're describing is the psychedelics really broke through the structure that your system had constructed to keep you functional. And that structure could have involved compartmentalization or dissociation. And your psychedelic use broke through that, but it wasn't held well enough, or the container wasn't there well enough for for you to get completely to the other side of the trauma.
Yeah. There was no container put in place, and the idea of relationship wasn't an option in my mind, which is very much necessary for my own process. So yeah, like prior to that moment, I didn't really experience fear. I'll just put it that way. And after that moment, I'm swimming in and out of terror, if not fear, throughout the whole time.
Yeah. Well, you got reassociated to fear.
Yeah, it's quite unpleasant.
So I think it's useful how we're even in this example, we're describing it to where, there's a blending of things that were clearly, not helpful. And yet there's something about this destabilization process that was, your system's attempt at coming home, at reassociating to some of the things that happened to you.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely got me desperately looking for another solution. So it did that job. Why? Yeah.
Well, there you go. Yeah. you know, when I will chime in, not on a personal story this time, but more on something that we saw pretty reliably, I would say, in the MAPS trials, which is, you know, I was part of the phase 2 trial of MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And the way that phase 2 was run is that, you know, the participants would either get, it was a double blind study, and the participants would have 3 day-long sessions, and we would not know if they got the full dose of MDMA or if they would get what's called a comparator dose, so which was 40 milligrams, right? And 40 milligrams is the amount that MAPS came up with to say, you know, people will feel some alteration on 40 milligrams, but you should not be enough. That should not be enough for you to do meaningful therapeutic work on it. And so anyway, what we saw with people doing that work was that, you know, the door, especially obviously if you got the full dose MDMA, the doors would open up, right? Your subconscious mind, your unconsciousness would open up. All this material would come in. You'd be working with it for, you know, 6 to 8 hours. A lot of trauma for people would come up, but it was being well held, right? This was in a therapeutic container. These people were being taken care of. There were 2 clinicians with them the whole time, and so, you know, there's a lot of support for these people to, you know, crunch through the traumas. But however, you know, that comes to an end, and so most people aren't done in 1 session with all of their traumas, or I would say even 3 sessions with all of their traumas. And so what would happen is, you know, the 6 to 8 hours would come to an end, and then the medicine would wear off, and you know, this person would have all of this material sitting in their lap. And for some people that had a lot of ability to resource themselves, a lot of foundation, a lot of relationship coming into those clinical trials, then, you know, it disrupted their life. It destabilized them, but they were relatively okay. However, there was another group of people where, you know, they needed a lot of therapeutic contact hours between their MDMA sessions in order to hold them together, right? So if you think about it, so, you know, let's say if somebody got the full dose of MDMA, they would get over a period of 3 months, they would get, you know, 24 hours altogether of psychedelic therapy sessions, right? So 8-hour chunks. There were some people that we probably would have like another, like, from one MDMA session to another one, we'd probably have another like 70 to 75 contact hours holding this person together, right? So just saying that I think what we're talking about here in terms of destabilization is not necessarily even specific to the PSIP model. Certainly we have it because we're purposefully going for you know, the structure and what's underlying the structure, and we're going for dissociation that really holds a lot of that structure together. But even if you're not using this model, I think, you know, there will be clients that have a great deal of dissociation going on.
You know, Daniel, what strikes me about your story is, I think you said, tell me if this is right, but you were really pushing for the deeper stuff, like the high dose, and that, I think, that approach of pushing hard without a lot of what we call solution, meaning mostly good relational support to hold it, is not a good combination, as you're basically telling us with your story. That's one of the red flags for me when I'm, you know, working with clients and having people who are, you know, wanting to really go for it, quote unquote, and we have really very blunt conversations about, you know, what's the relational, blunt but kind and compassionate, but just really honest conversations about, you know, how's your solution right now, how are your friendships, how's your community, what's out there for you if we open up things that are going to be pretty destabilizing.
Yeah, that was very much it on my side. Yeah, high doses. I think during that period of my life, I was doing, I think on average, every 3 to 4 weeks, doing a high synthetic mushroom journey, as well as complementing it with, I think, 3 to 4 hours of meditation per day. So a lot of like trying to push into things, and I think inadvertently looking for like cathartic experiences because my system didn't have the capacity to resource. There was a lot of like blind spots that I had due to the sheer amount of dissociation in my system. And so I think these things that you're naming, um, they weren't things that I was tracking or even knew that I needed, or the idea of destabilization or having something to support or capture that. Those were things that I was tracking. Although I would make those suggestions for other people, I wouldn't make that suggestion for myself because that would require another human in my process, which I wasn't willing to work with.
Mhm. I think that's a critical piece that you're naming there, Daniel, is like a lot of destabilization comes because we're avoiding the solution that needs to be in place, which is in your case, it was the relational solution. And so if the system is seeing relational solution as way too much of a threat, it's just in a constant destabilization process. It can't actually reach for what it needs. And so then it leaves everyone in a bystander role, right? They can see you destabilized and they're wanting to help, but your system won't allow them. And so then you're just caught in a loop of like destabilization, and then doing cathartic experiences and reaching for this medicine and that medicine and doing this and this, trying to fix the destabilization. And all it's doing is actually reinforcing it or managing it. And I could see friends or therapists like going, okay, well, maybe we need to help you by bringing in some relational solution to get you to the other side. And your system's like, nope, putting them in bystander, and you just get caught in that destabilization loop. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, yeah. That describes those 2 years of destabilization better than I could ever describe it. Yeah, that's spot on. But that's what definitely kept my system trapped in destabilization. And some of the other folks that I've spoken to that have been stuck, in destabilization for a few months, that's one of the patterns that I'll see. Want to move towards something, but the thing that they want to move towards is also what brings on threat. So then there's no way to like settle the system. There's not enough solution. There's no direction one system can organize into.
Yeah.
Maybe it's useful here to just talk about an assumption that we have to a large extent in non-psychedelic therapy, which is a lot of times we're working to avoid destabilization.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to just point out that for the most part, mental health looks at destabilization as a negative thing. We call it decompensating, and I think we have a different relationship with it. I think you have to, if you're doing psychedelic therapy, you have to have a different relationship with it. And certainly in the PSIP world, we have a different relationship with it, which is to say that we're not looking to avoid it, right? I think it's kind of necessary for healing to take place.
Daniel,
I would almost.
I was just going to ask Dan if you're willing to share a little bit about how it's been, with your destabilization process and PSIP, and anything that you feel comfortable sharing around that.
Much less destabilization as relational solution has come into the picture. Yeah, that was really the missing piece. So finding ways for a relationship to feel available or safe enough. That's been the main piece of my work. So once that starts to settle in, the pockets of destabilization are much more tolerable, and they're also finite versus feeling that I'm swimming in a place endlessly.
Thank you.
And I would say the type of destabilization I experience now, to what Saj was like naming, I think those are more of the, I think in a way, inevitable like destabilization that happens as I'm working through certain material, certain defense structures like soften and something emerges, like it is a very destabilizing and like shaky process that takes place. I think the destabilization I experienced for that 2.5 year period, I don't think that was necessary. I think there was much better ways to support that. There was certain conditions that were not put in place. I shouldn't have been doing high dose mushroom sessions like that on my own, in my opinion. And I think the support that I was looking for didn't. I think the therapist I was working with at that time didn't know exactly how to work with the complexity of my system and that level of destabilization. So in a way, that process was unnecessary, while certain pockets of destabilization I find to be necessary in this process. And if you're able to support it in the right way, then it's not so much like, is destabilization going to happen or not? Like in my mind, I think it's going to happen. It's more so, how do you support it, and in what ways do you work with it, and how do you prepare someone to move through that process?
Yeah. I like what you're saying there in terms of it's going to happen. And I would broaden it, Saj, when you're saying our therapeutic industry or our therapeutic sector, like it doesn't want the destabilization. I would almost say that as a culture, we pathologize destabilization. It's not just the therapeutic industry. So, and so here you have so much programming that happens within the psyche that says this is bad, right? At the individual level, at the family level, at the therapy level, the therapeutic industry level, at the cultural level. So we're fighting that. And so then when the system destabilizes, the system's like, yay, good, we need destabilization because that's going to help us evoke something new, right? There's that potentiality that wants to emerge within the system. And part of being a complex system is it has to, it's a must, it's as important as breath to destabilize. And because there's going to be more of you, more potentiality on the other side of that. And yet you have this huge cultural family narrative, all these layers that say, no, don't go there. And so here you have this sort of like sort of dilemma that emerges within the psyche. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And you're fighting yourself, you're fighting your own biology. So I think there needs to be a lot of psychoeducation around it to help support normalizing the whole process.
Yep.
And then you have, like, as a therapist, you had mentioned, well, the therapist didn't know how to work with it. It's like, that could be for many reasons, but one is the countertransference. If that therapist has been raised in a culture in a therapeutic industry where it's pathologized, how much of that countertransference is coming in, and they're not able to tolerate that level of intensity or destabilization that emerges. And so there you have that pattern going on as well.
I'd love to bring in the two-hand model right here. I think it'd be a really good visual to capture what we're talking about. This is one I learned from you, Saj, that I use in my trainings a lot. So we have the forward hand, which is our day-to-day self that we present to the world. Back here, the hand at the back is holding all the unresolved trauma in our nervous system and the experience of it. And it's got a lot of energy that's stuck in the nervous system, and that stuck energy is creating symptoms in the day-to-day world, like anxiety or reactivity or poor sleep and so on, and cravings and so we have maybe lots of unhealthy ways to try to keep those symptoms from taking over or feeling, awful. But we can also have therapeutic approaches that give us ways to manage the symptoms. And there's nothing wrong with that. So in other words, some therapy is mostly just helping us manage our symptoms, which we need to have ways to manage our symptoms day to day in order to function. But that's not processing the stuck energy in the nervous system. So that stuck energy is creating symptoms. We can maybe use breath or ways to think about it differently, so on. And that helps the symptoms not take over and, get us into more of a destabilized place. And then other models of trauma therapy are maybe gently trying to bring some of that charge through the system in a more titrated way. Maybe a little bit of both. And with PSIP, we're trying to bring the charge all the way through the system and let the autonomic nervous system move it all the way through so that there's less of that pressure back here creating the symptoms. And that's an ongoing process because most of us have a lot of trauma stored back here, particularly when we're talking about attachment trauma and so on. And so in this process where we're trying to bring the trauma forward, or part of it to process it through, that is a destabilizing process that just inherently is going to have some destabilization, because this version of ourself has built defenses and structures to keep this back here. So these defenses and structures are kind of getting destabilized and not there to hold us together so much, so that this can come through. And then, maybe afterward, sometimes we feel great and we kind of come back together. Sometimes after, we're like, what's going on in my day-to-day life now? And I better turn to friends, therapists, whoever, to help me hold this destabilized place and integrate it, and until I can get to the next piece. And so I'll just pause there and see if you guys have anything to add to that. Or
if I could build out on that as well, like just throwing out like an arbitrary number with this model that we're working off of. Let's say the average person is living 70-80% of their life in the front, and then they're having triggers throughout their day that kind of like wake up and has reactivity in their system, and then they have the capacity to manage it and pull it back here so that most of them could be in the present moment, or at least a portion of them. When I'm thinking about destabilization, what's happening is that ratio is like switched, right? Like if I'm thinking about the 2.5 years of me being destabilized, this thing that's in the front that's connected to day-to-day life is constantly being distorted by terror, by fear, by my unresolved trauma. And there's not the capacity to manage, to resource, to cope, to pull that back. So I think that's a common thing that happens in destabilization for people. The material that we're working with hits the surface, and there's just not the capacity to bring it back, to soften it, and you're just swimming in that material until it reorganizes or it completes. And whether that's by doing more sessions or by stepping away from the material, and whether that's like days, weeks, or months, it tends to kind of go back into the recesses of the mind, and the person will go back into their function. But that's the way I kind of understand it. Which also means that I think within PSIP, if someone's coming into, or PSIP or psychedelic therapy in general, if someone's coming in and they're destabilized, like all of the material is here in the front, there is some people that want to do like large mushroom experiences to see if you could push that through to the other side and have this correction. The approach we usually take is if someone is already in this state, we want to build the capacity for this to kind of go.
Mandra's
really
part of
drawn to
your demonstration.
really drawn to the hands. If someone is destabilized and this is to the front, we want to find ways to stabilize their system and bring this to the back, right? So that more of them could be in the present moment. They can have pockets of relief, pockets of stability, rather than opening up the doors, disrupting defense structures, and trying to complete more of that process. Yeah. If someone is swimming in their nightmare, we don't want to keep encouraging that if that's how they're coming into our office.
Yeah, so it's a strategic approach, right? Meaning that we're gauging where somebody is, and if somebody is, so yeah, and when somebody's not in process, when somebody's at home and they have to, go to work and be functional for their family, we absolutely want them to have this ability to pull this back into the background instead of having it be so foreground. But so, and I think a lot, again, that's symptom management, right? That's what tends to happen in therapy most of the time. And I think the unique part of what we're suggesting here is that it's actually necessary and valuable for times when this material comes to the foreground like that. So, and which, by the way, that's what we call being triggered, right? Like when you're triggered into a reaction, that's what's happening. This is coming to the foreground, and you're no longer just seeing present moment reality. You're seeing sort of the traumatic event. You're seeing your childhood. You're seeing your perpetrator, things like that. And so instead of this happening kind of haphazardly and randomly in a person's life, we would love to actually, we're purposefully setting off landmines in the client system, right? Because they're there. And we're saying like, okay, instead of you getting really good at, just like really being up here, being in this foreground position with your managed self, we're saying, how about let's purposefully set off this landmine, but do it in a therapeutic container, right? So it doesn't ruin your relationship. It doesn't, your partner doesn't become your perpetrator and you're projecting that onto your partner. So I think that's the value of doing it, because if you're doing this all the time, then there's a ton of management that has to happen to keep these two separate, right? To keep this from showing up, especially when triggers are taking place. You have to, becomes almost a full-time job, I would say, to have to manage that much. And I think the approach here, and what we're, again, in PSIP, but I would say ultimately in psychedelic therapy, is that it's not about management. I don't see psychedelic therapy going in and people going into psychedelic spaces and the medicine and the process being about let me it's not saying let me show you how to cope better with this. It's typically saying, no, let's deconstruct everything that you've built up to make you functional, and let's get to the heart of this, right? And that's not me saying it. I think that's organically what we reliably see in people's systems. And so I don't know if this is an appropriate time. I'll just kind of float this out there, but like, to me, to my mind, this is one of the reasons why I think models that really operate, that hold kind of tightly to a window of tolerance idea, which I think probably most people on this call are familiar with. It's basically saying, we want your system to operate within sort of a workable range. So not too activated, not hyper aroused, and not hypo aroused, right? So not dissociative or not panicky, but like someplace right in the middle. And that's what's considered to be a tolerable, like, therapeutic zone. And it's true that you won't get to destabilization that way, but again, at least from what I tend to see in the world and in people's systems, trauma doesn't live in the tolerable zones, right? Trauma lives, the self that was traumatized lives in the extremes. It lives in the destabilization. So what we're essentially saying here to people is, let me be in relationship with you in this highly destabilized place that you have inside of yourself.
I know I know both worlds, right? And I feel like I know the world of window of tolerance very well because of my somatic experiencing background. And I know this world very well. And I'd have to say my capacity to master my own reinvention, my own self-discovery, and master the trauma in a way in which something new can emerge, way better understanding it from like the PSI model and complex systems model. Window of tolerance kind of gave me, like, I was constantly in a shame cycle, because it's like, oh, I'm getting too destabilized. Oh, bring it back. And it's like the management that it would take to stay in that was quite hard. And I think I stressed a lot of my SE practitioners out because I was just a landmine of destabilization everywhere. and no one really wanted to work with me because I would just be like, oh, couldn't do it. It would be like playing whack-a-mole with me. But I want to speak to one piece on this is, like, when you ask the question about destabilization, in a way, I have been destabilized my whole life. Like, destabilization was who I was. If I look at even the children that I used to be a child therapist, if I look at these children, they're completely destabilized because they're in a family system that is dysfunctional, and so the child is going to be completely destabilized and trying to manage that because there's no family unit, there's no relational unit to support sort of like moving through that destabilization. So then these children go to therapy to get help for the destabilization, however that's showing up: ADHD, depression, right, anxiety, all of these ways. And then the therapist is like being asked, treat my child. Well, how does the therapist going to treat the child? The child can either move through the destabilization, but then it's going to put pressure on the parents to actually work on their content, which doesn't happen in our culture. So then the therapist is just, well, I guess all I have to do is teach them how to manage, teach the child how to cope and manage. So now we are pumping out more and more kids, more and more teenagers into the world that are just reinforcing that destabilization is bad, and we're letting off all these parents off the hook, right? So just to see that destabilization is a really important process, important part to the process of, I don't know if you want to call it self-authorship. What it does is it then puts pressure on those relationships around the child. And so if you grow up and now you're doing PSI, what's going to happen is you're going to destabilize and then you're going to bring the pieces of relationship back into the foreground of like, this isn't working, this relationship isn't working, which is going to bring up a huge amount of terror. Like, it's like, well, as a kid, these relationships failed me. How do I expect to destabilize and move through the process? Because I'm just anticipating failure again. And then the person gets stuck, reaching for the old, trying the new, and then they get stuck in that. So that was my process, to the point where when I destabilized as a kid, the thought for the therapist was, let's give this child ECT, as opposed to let's give this child an environment where she can actually heal, which means putting pressure on the parents. And so I just want to bring in that element of just how strongly associated our culture is to damping down on the destabilization. And I do think window of tolerance is part of that, kind of like, it's an attempt at treating the destabilization, but I still feel like there's some level of therapeutic countertransference that's in that message that says it's bad, right? So.
No, I think that's really powerful, Jaya. Like, I mean, you're speaking to the system, a system that does not have a solution to it. And therefore, the solution becomes, well, let's deal with the reactivity that's happening here, right? And, I'm just thinking of Murray Bowen, who's we all probably encountered Bowen's work in graduate school, where he's famous for saying, there's no such thing as a schizophrenic child, there's schizophrenic families, right? And so he's a family systems person. He's saying like individuals will be having these reactions to the larger system, and if you just pick one individual as there's something wrong with this person, and you're just trying to sort of dampen down those reactions, that's not really dealing with what's going on here, right? And yeah. So I guess the real question in therapy is like, what's the goal of therapy? Is it to not have symptoms, or is it to have resolution? Because those are not the same thing. Right? And that might be a different way of thinking about it. But just because your client does not have symptoms doesn't mean they have resolved things. Just because a kid has learned to manage things in their family doesn't mean that sort of the amount of reactivity is actually resolved. It doesn't mean that this person can grow up and have a relationship. There tends to be a lot of management here. So
yeah, and if you look at,
please go ahead. No, go ahead.
And this is such an important topic, this piece here, in terms of like So let's say you have a child, and like I worked in this field, and it was so torture to watch every single child come, and they were destabilized in all these different ways. And then I was having to be part of the problem by basically seeing them in a pathologized way and helping them treat these symptoms. Now I am becoming part of the perpetration of that child, right? And the agony that that creates inside of me, and how much destabilization is then happening inside of me because I'm doing something that's subtly, I don't know if we want to call it immoral, but I'm just reinforcing the problem. So then we have this perpetuating like cultural system of a child destabilized. Now the therapist is destabilized because the therapist is doing something subtly like not in alignment with biology. So then I'm going to go and try to stabilize or manage my own destabilization. And how do I do that? I've got to rationalize my own behavior. And so you see this cascading effect that happens, ripples through the whole culture of we're all attempting to kind of like band-aid the destabilization together. And after I was like given ECT, the way in which I kept reinforcing that, because it didn't work, I would just keep destabilizing, was I then created a binge eating disorder. I had to binge to shove all that destabilization under. And then if I tried to stop the binging, guess what would happen? Destabilization, not allowed within my family system. So then I would try to diet and control my food through food plans. And then you start seeing this whack-a-mole game, binging, dieting, and underneath it is a big wealth of destabilization that needs to be addressed. Right? But if I was to address it, then it then put pressure on the people around me. So you get stuck in that dynamic.
Yeah. So I'm thinking we could go, there's a question here by Enna Soft. So how important is locus of control in fostering destabilization? Yeah. And Anna, go ahead and chime in if you would like to around this, but I think how I'm understanding the question is, you know, you know, I think you're asking, is it important for the client to have the locus of control shifted into their lap, and as the destabilization is happening, meaning they're in charge of the destabilization. If that's not what you're asking, then please chime in and let us know. But I think, I mean, there's a number of ways of describing this, right? So I think that destabilization is not, we're not in charge of it, right? It's something that's really kind of, it's something, you know, the identity that, how are we doing this? You know, this identity that we've developed, right, is going to be destabilized by much more information that is coming into the system. And so, you know, so like, so in other words, what I'm suggesting here is that, you know, something much larger is happening than what this small version of yourself is actually prepared for. Yeah.
Can I give
Yeah.
I give this question a try?
Yeah.
So I almost see it as if, so you're married, you're in a marriage with your nervous system, you're in a marriage with this complex system. So it's not boss and you're not boss, right? You're participating in, like, you're co-creating something new with this. And so what I've discovered is I had to kind of throw out the window of tolerance thing for myself and instead learn how to master working with this complex nervous system and the destabilization that it's craving. And before, what would happen is it would just hijack me and I'd be completely destabilized and running after it, trying to manage it. And so in some ways it had the control, it had the locus of control, or I'd hand over that control to an external party like a therapist. And that didn't work either, because then I also felt helpless, and so did the therapist. So I had to learn two skills. One, I had to learn how to manage in a way in which, like, when did I need to manage? When did I need to resource? Lifting the lid and closing it, lifting the lid and closing it. That was one skill I had to learn, right? The other skill is, once destabilization for me happens when I start clearing out dissociation. Once I start clearing out dissociation, my system is going to destabilize. At that point, I am looking to begin to master the content, the material that is underneath the dissociation that's coming to the surface. So that means kind of listening to it, attuning to my body, understanding how to actually even further work, like loosen up the dissociation in ways in which allows me to get new insights, new perspectives that I can move forward with. Right. So instead of feeling helpless to the destabilization, I'm sort of like, okay, I'm sensing a day where I'm destabilized. How can I work with this? Right? What are the tools that I need to do to either manage it or go into it further to loosen up further of the destabilization and begin to reorganize it? So those were sort of my two strategies, learning how to resource and learning how to master the destabilization that's emerging as the dissociation clears out.
Mhm. Yeah. So it's almost like you're saying I'm opening the floodgates and then I'm closing the floodgates. But what comes through the floodgates, it's its own thing, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm in the discovery, right? You use that word, Saj, discovery. Like you're having to just be in the uncertainty and the discovery of the whole process. And like, how do I work with this? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's